All right, so welcome. I am very excited to be here today to do this talk. And I actually crafted this talk specifically for you guys today. And it's, I do teach similar topics, but this exact layout is unique to your group and based off of a request that we had. And so we're going to talk a little bit about herbal teas, all focusing on things that you can either grow or wildcraft in your local area, and us being all in New Hampshire, although a lot of these herbs are applicable to other kind of temperate climate areas as well. And we'll give you a little bit of background about medicinal herbs and growing herbs and harvesting herbs, safety, all that other good stuff, a little bit on blending, just tiny bits and pieces on these things, how to make tea. And then we'll get into some of my favorite herbs. And the slides are very detailed, and there are a lot of slides that are bonus slides. So all the ones that you see with these little stars on them are bonus slides. So that means that I will probably not be talking about those slides, but I figured since I had them already available, I would include them in the slideshow. And that way you can go back and, refer to those slides if you want a little extra information. And so you should have received a email already, I believe, from Christine with access to the slides as a PDF. But if not, give me a shout. And also when we send the replay out, we'll have that there too. And also if you see these underlined things, there might be a couple of those throughout. Those are usually going to be hot links. So once you have the PDF open on your screen, if you click on that, it might open up a book or an article or blog post. I definitely have a lot of links to various blog posts that I've done so you can get extra information there. So let me dive right in, and actually let me get my mouse going. My mouse likes to go to sleep on me frequently, but it means I don't have to keep reaching forward to the computer to move my way through. So just a little bit about me. My name is Maria Noel Groves. I am a clinical herbalist. My practice is my practice is Wintergreen Botanicals in Allenstown, New Hampshire. So I'm right surrounded by Bear Brook State Park on all sides, and I have some gardens here. My focus is not on product making, so I definitely do, grow herbs, harvest herbs, process herbs, and I have some students who occasionally help me out with that as well. But it's mainly for personal use, for clients, for classes. I don't sell products. That's not my focus at all. It's all about education. So I do see clients. I am seeing a lot fewer these days just because I'm super booked up with other things and I just haven't had the time. So I'm not taking new clients right now, but I do see clients, and I have current clients that I continue to work with and do health consultations. I do a lot of teaching, and that's been my main focus lately. It's always been a big part of my practice, but then especially in this pandemic year, there's been a lot of interest in herbal classes. And so I don't do anything in person in the pandemic, but I have been doing lots of online classes for folks all around the country and even the world, which has been a lot of fun. But I've been an educator for probably close to 20 years talking about herbs. And I've been an herbalist for a little longer than that. I also have a journalism background. I have a journalism degree. I used to be an editor for Natural Health magazine, and I continue to freelance for a lot of different publications about herbs. And I also have my 2 books. So I do love to write. And on my website, I have just tons of free information as well. Here are my 2 books, Body into Balance and Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies. I also have them behind me. They're both really, I'm biased, obviously, since I wrote them, but they are both really beautiful and really dense with information and really easy to read and great introductions to herbal medicine. So Body into Balance is more about like a primer to your body and how it should work, and then how to use herbs and diet and lifestyle to bring it back into balance. So that's the more, it's a little bit more dense. There's even more content there and a little bit more of the big picture. And then Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies is a little bit lighter, but still full of information and more specific to herbs that you can grow for your health that are easy to grow. And all the plants are plants that I have grown at some point in time or another, some better. Most of them I grow all the time. Some of them are not, don't grow super great in my particular yard. I'm a warm 4B, a little cold pocket out here. And so basically, let's say you want herbs for brain boosting. Here are a couple herbs that you might consider that are easy to grow. And then here's how to use them, how to harvest them. And here are various recipes that you can make with them. And then there are individual plant profiles for all the plants covered in that book. So that's a little bit about the books. You can get them through me. That's great. I love it. It supports me best when people order books through me, but it isn't really like you're not getting any great deals getting it through me. The Concord Food Co-op does have some signed copies in the store, so you can get it through them, and they even have online shopping with pickup. and you can get it at most bookstores. And the cheapest way to get it is on Amazon. So, however people want to get books and works for them is fine by me. I have lots of information on my website and you can check it out. Of course, I have information about the work that I do, but I also just have a lot of free information on the website. The blog in particular got recommended reading, recommended sources. So I did make note, not as many as I could have, but in certain areas throughout the slides, I have links to various blog posts and spots on the website where you can get more information. Because I love to share information. That's really what I'm the most passionate about in my herbal practice. Some safety rules, because I think it's good for us to be empowered and safe and well-educated in our herbal medicine practice. And all the herbs we're talking about today are really pretty safe and well-tolerated by most people, but no one herb is perfect for everybody. So, first and foremost, I'm not a doctor, so I can't diagnose and prescribe no matter where I am, but particularly in this setting, it's, even more limited than say when I'm doing a consultation, because I don't know your history. I don't know what medications you're on. I don't know if you're pregnant or nursing, and all these things may determine whether or not an herb is actually appropriate for you to use. And just different herbs have affinities for different people. Different people have different affinities for different herbs. So just treat this as general information, and you're going to want to either seek guidance, or in most cases, it's safe to just, do your own kind of self-treating, but educate yourself so that you can go about it in a smart way. And it's always good to keep your doctor in the loop too, and your pharmacist if you're on any pharmaceuticals. But if you are thinking about playing around with new herbs, and I might pause for a moment and shut some of these windows because the noise on the street. If you are hearing the noise on the street, let me know in the chat box, and I'll close up the windows in a moment. So if you are planning on starting to use herbs for the first time, and it's not one that you've used before and you're already familiar with and know that you do okay with it, I suggest researching it in at least 3 different good quality resources, totally different perspectives. So different herbalists, maybe one that's more science-based, and get some of that perspective on how to use it, the different things you could use it for, what cautions there may be, and each source will have a little bit different information. So it's nice to get it from a variety of sources. And that's where I have on my website, there's a recommended reading page for all sorts of great books. And then there's also the links page that has links to various websites. And those are really nice ones to start off with, because there's good quality information, there's bad quality information out there. And when I worked for Natural Health Magazine, I ran the fact-checking department. And so I got to be a little bit of a stickler on quality sources. And that's where those sources all come from, are ones that I personally think are good quality. Secondly, it's also important, in addition to all that research, like I'm analytical, I love to research stuff, but in addition to that, it's a good idea to listen to your body and listen to your intuition. And some people, that speaks to them even more than the research, but I think it's nice to have a mix of both of those when you're approaching herbal medicine. So, maybe you get a message in a dream or in a prayer, or you meditate with a plant, or some people like to douse. I'm not really the best teacher for plant spirit medicine. It's not really my forte. And there are lots of other great herbalists in the state that are so much better at teaching that than I am. But that's one way of working with the plants. And you can also just listen to your body as you do, take a little bit at first and just kind of sit with the plant, see how you feel. Notice, as time goes on, do you have any positive effects or even negative effects, and gradually work up your dose over time while you're assessing, are you getting the positive effects you want? Sometimes you get those almost immediately, and sometimes they take, weeks or even months to gradually build. Or are you having anything negative? Maybe it gives you a bit of a headache, or you just feel like you have to pee a lot and you don't really like how that feels, or maybe it keeps you awake at night, or maybe it makes you too sleepy or something like that. Just, key in. I think listening to your body is a really useful tool for us. And ultimately, how your body responds to the herbs is the most important of all. So it's good to be in touch. If you're doing any harvesting, and that's kind of what this class is about, is whether you're cultivating it or a few plants that we'll talk about that grow wild and are common, you need to make sure that you've correctly identified it. And I would never take anything for granted. Don't assume that because you bought a plant with a name tag in it, that it is what it says it is. Don't assume that because you planted it from a little packet of seeds, that what popped up is what this packet of seeds says it is. Sometimes seeds are mislabeled, and sometimes people plant something and their seeds don't germinate, but something else grows in its place. And I've seen every year I get at least one set of seedlings. That's not what it was supposed to be when I buy it at various really good garden centers. So mistakes happen. People will sell you things or give you things, and it turns out to not be what it was supposed to be. So go through the motions, look it up online, get some botanical descriptions. If it's a wild plant, field identification guides are great for that. If it's not wild, it can be a little bit trickier, but at the very least, Googling it and finding some good botanical websites or some of the botanical gardens and some of the government and school websites might have botanical descriptions and photos. The USDA has some things, and I'll have a few resources as we get into this. So just kind of like look at it, be like, is this what I think it is? And does it fit the description? And make sure that it does before you start taking it. And then I mentioned before, if you're on pharmaceuticals, you'll want to double check for herb drug interactions. And if you're on a lot of pharmaceuticals, then that's probably a good time to not just ask your pharmacist and let your doctor know, but maybe even hire an herbalist or a naturopathic doctor so that they can guide you. But if you're just on one medication, sometimes you can do, the research yourself and just know what to avoid and go ahead and play around with herbs on your own. It really depends on the scenario. Also, I will say that breastfeeding and pregnancy are not my specialties. So a lot of the herbs we're talking about today are probably safe in those scenarios, and some are probably not safe. But because the data is so mixed and inconsistent, we really don't have a lot of scientific data to turn to, and I don't specialize in that. I don't really feel comfortable doling out that advice, but there are folks like Aviva Ram who have really great books, and Camille Freeman is another really great source for that kind of information. So sources and books, specifically on growing medicinal herbs, I have a bunch listed here. Of course, there's my book, which is a really nice starter one, especially if you want to just be doing it on your own and you're starting with like easy growing and learn how to make medicine with it and how you use them medicinally and what recipes you can make. If you want something a little bit more intense, and especially if you're a farmer who's thinking about growing these on a market level, growing herbs has some amazing aspects to it. It's also a really, really challenging growing industry to be in part because you have to find or create your market for it. But also herbs are a totally different animal than growing vegetables. And Jeff and Melanie Carpenter's book, The Organic Medicinal Herb Farmer, is excellent to get into the business side of things. And there are a couple other business related books too, but that's the one that I am most familiar with. And they also have really nice profiles on the individual plants that they discuss in there, including some unusual ones. They even have like a whole chapter on the science of drying and how to build a really nice drying room for dehydrating herbs. And, they just get a lot more in depth than most of your other sources will, but are still easy to read and nicely laid out. Tammy Hartung has a couple nice books, including Homegrown Herbs. Leah Penniman has a great book. I'm trying to work on exploring more resources that are written by non-white people. And Leah is one of the sources that I've come across that has some really great information out there, really easy to read, really passionate and wonderful. And so her book, Farming While Black, does have great information, even for those of us who are white, to learn about herbs from a different perspective and just kind of appreciate herbs and appreciate the diversity around the farming industry as well. And they have lots of really great gardening resources on the Soulfire Farm website too. If you want to get into traditional Chinese medicine plants or Ayurvedic plants, the Chinese Medicinal Herb Farm book by Peg Schaefer is like the book on the topic, and it's really nicely done. A lot of these, not all, but a lot of these books are either coming from Chelsea Green publishers or Story publishers. Those are two of the big publishing companies that do these kinds of books. Jekka McVicker's in the UK, and she has lots of herb books, including the Complete Herb book, and also lots of information on her website. Christopher Hobbs has a nice book, Grow It, Heal It. Juliette Blancasfor has tons of information just on her website, Chestnut School of Herbal Medicine. Both Susan Belsinger and Arthur Tucker individually and together have a lot of books on growing herbs that are nicely done. And Rich Ochek runs Strictly Medicinal Seeds, which is one of the main places online to get seeds and plants, especially like a very wide array of unusual medicinal herbs. And he has a lot of good info, just basic stuff on his website, especially on growing seeds. But then he also has some books too, so you can check that out. And then I have my website for more. And then there is this link here to a big herb growing chart. And that was supposed to be the appendix of Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies, but it got cut for space from the book. But it's this nice chart that goes into common garden and wild plants and what zones they grow in and how they clump, how they spread, how they, just all sorts of information, what kind of light, what kind of water, just kind of a quick chart to see a bunch of different plants. And so you can download that for free by clicking on the link on the slides once you have the PDF of the slides. I'm not going to get into all these books here, but this slide has a lot more information about extra books that are good for getting to know the medicinal side of the herbs, and particularly just kind of in general, but many of them are herbs that you can grow or are wild plants. So some of my favorites are listed there in addition to my own. And if you are going to be growing herbs in your wine, to know where to get just like a couple seedlings here or there, New Hampshire Urban Garden Day is usually a really good source. We may or may not be having an in-person event this year. They're trying to figure that out right now, and it may or may not be in Canterbury. So stay tuned, but that is potentially in the works. And there are lots of great growers that you can still connect with, even if you aren't able to get to the event. So Herb Pharmacy in Massachusetts, Foundwell Farm may or may not be fully open. I think she probably is reopening in her new location this year. Pickety Place has some herbs. Warner River Farm is one of my favorite places to get seedlings, and I have more listed on my website. And then if you want to do mail order, there are a variety of places like Strictly Medicinal Seeds, Zach Woods, Companion Plants, and a lot of them will sell seedlings through the mail. And then there are lots of seed houses too. And I do have lots more sources on my website. And I won't get too into this slide either, just for the sake of time, but a lot of people want to know, maybe you don't have herbs that you've grown yet, and you just want to know where you can buy good quality herbs. And whenever possible, getting them directly from the grower, from the farmer, is usually going to be the best quality. So that's my first choice if you're not growing them yourself. And some of my favorite farms are listed on here. And I will say that Misty Meadows in Lee is my favorite herb shop in New Hampshire. And they have herbs from all over, but they have a whole wall that's specifically herbs that they've grown themselves on location. And their quality is probably the best that I've seen for a herb shop. And they have tons of stuff. It's just really fun to spend lots of money in that store. Really easy to do. And then lots of great farms like Bee Fields Farm and Foster Farm Botanicals and Terra Basics and Zach Woods. And a lot of these places are in New Hampshire or in the Northeast. I have brands and other things too, but we're not going to get into that. So wild crafting, I just want to note that wild crafting is when you're going and harvesting a wild plant or foraging, but for whatever reason in herbal medicine, we often call it wild crafting. And I don't have time, I don't think, in today's lecture to really get into all the ins and outs and pros and cons and considerations, but I did throw a variety of slides into the slideshow. And then I also have a blog, and I have lists of field guides by our regional herbals, which are focused on the wild medicinal plants and how to use them, and some mushroom guides too that you can link to on the slides. And so I just want to, if you're going to do wild crafting, really educate yourself, avoid just kind of harvesting a bunch because you can, or you're excited about the plant, and get to know that plant and know its role in the ecosystem, how sensitive it is, and ideally focus on the more weedy species, and ideally harvest things from your own yard. If you have a nice yard, and since you're farmers, I'm going to guess you have plenty of wild plants popping up that you can play with. So weedy, common, abundant species that are usually pretty safe to harvest in large quantities if you want to would be things like dandelion, horsetail, burdock, nettle, raspberry leaf, alder, red clover. Those are all really great wild plants that are very common, and usually really you can, as long as they're coming from clean soil and all of that, you can usually wildcraft them pretty safely. I would be cautious about native, slow growing plants, even things that a lot of people do get really excited about. And move this a little bit further away from my mouth so you're not hearing too many peas there. But there are a lot of different resources that you can go to let you know if plants are sensitive or threatened or endangered, and just to raise your awareness of those, including like many of these are medicinal plants that we hear about and we get excited about, and some of our foraged wild foods too. So you can educate yourself on that and maybe avoid harvesting them, or if it's something that maybe is appropriate to harvest small quantities of, keep it small, learn how to harvest in a way that will have the least impact on the stand. And certainly some things like lady slipper, like you should just never harvest. My teacher, Michael Moore, would say that if you harvest lady slipper, you will be reincarnated as the motion sensor at the door at Walmart. So that was his word on things. He was very creative way of saying things. And then invasive plants, I would say go ahead and harvest those invasive plants, things like autumn olive and multiflora rose, and you could eat the garlic mustard and, all that other good stuff. But you want to make sure it's technically illegal to harvest invasive plants, and that's because they are concerned that people may intentionally or unintentionally propagate the plant. And definitely don't do that. Don't plant them. Don't take your Japanese knotweed roots that you didn't get to use and just dump them outside, because they will grow into new plants and take over your yard. So if you are going to harvest invasives, be aware that it's technically illegal. Nobody's probably going to care, but make sure that you don't propagate them intentionally or unintentionally, or make them any stronger than they already are. More information on these slides. Here's a good example of where with identification, it might be easy to make a very dangerous mistake. We're lucky in New Hampshire, we don't have a ton of really toxic plants, particularly we don't have a ton of them that look a lot like plants we might want to harvest, but foxglove is one of the biggies, and it does occasionally kill somebody. If you accidentally harvested and made tea with foxglove, you would die just from one leaf or one cup of tea. So be aware that when things are in their leafy stage, they can be really hard to identify. And when they're in flower, they're much easier to identify. And so if you're not sure, wait for it to flower. Take time to practice identifying things to make sure. And I do have, it's a very low quality tincture video from one of my old videos from my online courses. But if you go to it, you can see me go to each of the plants, foxglove, comfrey, and mullein, and compare the three of them. And it starts about 4 minutes and 41 seconds in. Some identification tips. Go Botany is a pretty good website. Newcomb's Wildflower Guide is one of my favorites for identifying wild plants in wild flowering plants, but I've got more info there. So if you have questions, feel free to pop those in the chat box. But what I really want to get to today is making tea and talking about some individual herbs. But before we get there, I am going to talk a little bit about harvesting plants and drying plants, because if you are going to be making your own teas, that's something you need to do first before you can get around to making teas with them. So unfortunately, it's a little too early in the season for me to have plants here to really show you how to harvest properly. I suppose I do have, if I thought ahead, I do have some plants behind me that I could have demonstrated with. Let me just grab, I don't have scissors, but I'll just grab something with my hands. Two of these plants are actually extras in your slides, and one of them is not in your slides, but we've got some rosemary here. So rosemary is a good example of a plant that branches. It's in the mint family, and a lot of the herbs that we like to cultivate are in the mint family. And so they've got opposite leaves, and they may also have opposite branches. It's just this particular specimen right here is not branching. But if you're going to harvest, the best place to harvest is just to pinch above a leaf node. And you may know this already since you're farmers, and having a, set of scissors or clippers is ideal. And then you'll have this left behind and it will keep growing from those sides. And that's the best way to harvest so that you continue to get good harvest throughout the year. And you want to start off with plants that are very happy and vibrant. Of course, you want to know what part of the plant that you should be harvesting. But that's a great way to kind of get into it. And I also have this picture here of Korean licorice mint, very closely related to anise hyssop. And that's one of my favorites. So I would just go in and ideally just snip like right above the leaf node right there. And then these side shoots would grow new. And you can get a lot of plant medicine, and herbs really want to be harvested pretty regularly throughout the garden season. They often will be stronger and more vibrant. They don't want to be hacked down to the ground. You want to make sure to leave at least a couple sets of leaves behind, maybe anywhere from like 1/3 to 2/3 of the plant to leave behind, depending upon how robust it is. But, as long as you're being mindful about how you go ahead and harvest it, you'll often keep getting new growth and bushier growth, and you'll end up with better quality plant material that you can harvest throughout the growing season. And, I've gotten many, many harvests out of like one area of lemon balm where I've had students who, when I talk to them in August, they're like, oh, should I be harvesting my lemon balm? I'm like, oh gosh, like I got a harvest in late May and another harvest or two in June and another harvest or two in July. And their plants are looking sad because the plants are like, well, we did our thing, we're all set. But because I kept harvesting mine, it was like, ooh, like I gotta grow some more. Like I got cut. I need to grow. And so you'll get more medicine usually by doing those regular harvests. Now, if you have something that doesn't really branch so much, but it just grows straight out of the ground. So this is a gotu kola leaf. It's an Indian plant that's used for food and medicine and brain tonic and all that. And we're not going to get too into it, but there is an extra slide on it. This is a plant that's in the parsley and ginseng family, and it tends to grow mostly right out of the ground. Occasionally it grows off of little viney type things, sort of like strawberries too. But I would just go down close to the base and pull that off. We also have a lot of our grassy things like lemongrass, also chives would be in this category where, you could, with some of those grassier things, you could trim them off the top and they'll keep growing. But usually I just cut right down to the base, but I won't cut everything that's in it. And chives you can cut down to the ground, but something like lemongrass, usually I'll maybe move through and cut like a portion of it, or parsley. I'll cut some of the older leaves, but leave some younger leaves. Same thing with the gotu kola. I'll go in and give it a pretty hard hack, but make sure that there are still a few baby leaves in there and it grows more vibrantly. Like I have some gotu kola here and a couple others throughout. And it was getting really sad and really thirsty and it was always wilting. And so finally I went in and just hacked it all down with just left a few leaves behind and made medicine with what was happy and composted what wasn't. And now the plants in the pots are so much happier because they got refreshed from that little trimming. So that's a little bit on how to harvest plants. And if anything's not clear, feel free to ask. And the flowers, usually you're just going to pinch off the whole head of the flower. So Korean licorice mint, you can use the leaves and the flowers together. But if this was something like roses or chamomile or something like that, often you'd go, or red clover, often you'd go in right underneath the flower and just kind of pinch off the whole flower head. If there are a few little leaves right there, in most cases, you just leave those leaves there. So something like chamomile has the little, I think it's the bracts that are holding the flower together, and red clover has a few little leaves right at the top. And you just harvest those right with it and dry them. It is a little trickier to dry flower heads because they are often, it's harder to get them dried all the way through. So we'll get to drying in a moment. Just some other things about harvesting leaves and flowers. You always want to do it when they're at their most happiest and vibrant. That said, if your plant is starting to get a little haggard, or maybe it's gotten a little buggy, nettle often gets really buggy. So, ideally you'd want to go out and harvest it before it got to that state. But if you find that it gets that, you can cut things back and often you'll get a second flush that's really nice. And if there's anything usable in what you cut back, then you can go ahead and use it. Or if it's just really sad looking, you could just compost it and then enjoy the next flush. Because, even if they're I don't really go through and pull off pests. I don't have time for that. But if I do have a pest problem, I'll just kind of cut the plant back a bit. And usually the pest's life cycle will have passed. And so the next flush that comes in and having happy, vibrant, strong plants will discourage there being a pest problem in the second flush, usually. If you're going to be harvesting plants, you usually don't wash them afterwards, because especially if you're going to be drying them, adding a bunch of moisture before you dry it, it ends up creating potentially even more problems with contamination of microbes and yeasts and things than if you didn't wash it at all. But, if it's really dirty, you could wash it a lot like lettuce and, put it in cold water, gently shake it around, run it through the salad spinner, let them air dry most of the way, and then put them in your dehydrator, or however we'll get to dehydrating in a moment. Or if it's in your yard and you have access to a hose, maybe before you harvest it, you can go out and give it a hose off, let it dry completely, and then, go out and harvest it. And also when you're harvesting, you want to wait until after the dew dries to go ahead and harvest it, or before the dew comes in at night would be the most ideal way. If there's anything that doesn't really look great, just pick it off and discard it. So next up, we have drying those leaves and flowers. And so if you're doing flowers, I really do prefer doing those in a dehydrator, because it's really hard to make sure that they're thoroughly dried through the middle. Oftentimes the outer petals dry really quickly, but the middles are challenging. So you want to do them in one flat layer, make sure there's good airflow, and ideally a dehydrator set to anywhere between 95 and 110 degrees. And as I mentioned, the book by Jeff and Melanie Carpenter gets really in depth into the dehydrating process. But the idea is that as things get a little bit more humid, you'll probably need to bump up the temperature just a little bit. So, when it's really humid in the middle of summer, if I try to dehydrate my herbs at 95 degrees, they just kind of sit there and look at me wilted, like, it's too humid. We can't dehydrate in this. So that's when I'll tend to bump the temperature up just a little bit to get it going. But if you get too hot, you cook all the goodness out of the plants. And so you don't want that either. So anywhere in that range, wherever it seems to be actively drying, but not like you're not smelling the herbs throughout the house, or, or it's not just sitting there looking at you, not drying at all. Airflow is really important. So if you are going to be air drying at all, then maybe having a fan underneath it could be helpful, just so that it doesn't give an opportunity for molds and yeast to grow as the plant is drying. But for flowers, I think the dehydrator really is the best way. I do like using the Excalibur. They're nice. They're good quality. I have no affiliations with them, except that I own one, but I don't profit off of them in any way. But they are kind of pricey. A lot of your cheaper dehydrators get too hot. If it's what you use to make jerky by plugging it in, it's too hot for herbs, and it'll cook all the goodness out of almost everything. So you want something that you can control the temperature on. And there are plans out there. And if you're a crafty person, you can make your own drying sheds and drying cabinets, and those are great too. And that's another way to work with it. Now, for leaves, they're a little bit more forgiving. So you still want to be it's still the same temperature range, and it's still good to keep an eye on airflow, especially if it's humid out. But even in general, it's good to keep an eye on airflow and maybe put a little fan under it or something. But you do have a little bit more flexibility, because they're a little bit more of a regular density, and so they dry more easily and more evenly. And you can air dry, but at least here in New Hampshire, and where I am in particular, it's just, I have a lot of very stagnant air, and it can get really humid. And whether it's hot or cold out, it's often really hard to dry herbs 100% just by air drying them, whether you're hanging them or you have them in screens like this picture here. So what you can do is, I would definitely use a fan if you're going to be air drying them, especially if it's humid out, and you can get them most of the way dry that way, and then use a little heat and crisp them up. Either put them in a dehydrator or use the car method. And so to do the car method, as you see here, I have probably about this amount. This is a chocolate mint here in this picture. And it's a variety of peppermint and probably about that much. And I put it in a brown paper bag, I leave them on the stems so that the stems create a little bit of airflow opportunity. And I put them in a brown paper bag, cinch it shut with a clothespin like you see in the picture. And then I put it in the windshield of my car. And usually within 1 to 2 days, the car temperature is just about the right temperature to be a dehydrator, be in that 95 to 110 degree. And you can always get a thermometer to put in your car so that you can assess and make sure that it's not getting too hot. You can crack windows if you need to a little bit. You can usually don't need to deal with a fan because it dries so quickly and it's a little bit on the warmer side. But, you can just kind of play around. If it's too hot, we've had some really hot summers lately for New Hampshire even. And so it might be too hot to put things in the windshield, but maybe you can put them on the seat of the car or in the trunk of the car as long as those places are clean. And it's even better if you start them drying at that lower temperature, get most of the moisture out, and then you can crisp them up. So that's what I've been doing lately. It takes up less space for me in the car and I can dry a lot more that way. And I seem to get a little bit better quality. So I got this screen from like iPalmetto on Amazon, and I just have them hanging with a little fan underneath them. And then when I'm about ready to process them and they're basically almost all the way dry, I'll put them in the brown paper bags and then crisp them up in the car for half a day. And then I'll go ahead and process them. So that's how I do it. If you have a dehydrator, that's ideal. And just be mindful that wherever you're drying them is clean, that there aren't mice and pests running all over the place. There usually are going to be some bugs on your plants. So give them a chance to just sort of escape or kind of like tap them off as you're harvesting. But you will find lots of like runaway spiders and things as you're harvesting and drying your plants. So give them a chance to evacuate the plant pile so that they don't end up in your tea. So extra slides here on roots. We don't do as much root harvesting, but there are some slides in here for that, and also bark and garbling. So garbling is the official term for when we kind of take our whole dried plants and then we pull the leaves off the stem or crunch things up into smaller pieces and make them so that they're more cut and sifted consistency that's easier to store, easier to make tea with. Of course, the more whole the plant is, the better it's going to retain its properties, but it's also, might have more air exposed to it because it's, it just takes up more space if it's that way. And it just takes up more space, might be less convenient to use. So usually what we'll do is we'll go in and we'll take the dried plants. And then if we assume that this was dry, we'd pull the leaves off the stems and then use our hands to crumple them up into smaller pieces. Flowers, I usually leave whole, but you could crunch them up if you wanted to. And then you store them in a cool, dark, dry spot so that they can be well preserved. But you want to make sure that the moisture is basically gone, because if there is still moisture in that plant before you garble it and store it, then it can ferment and mold in your containers. And that's, of course, that would be really sad to have gone through all that work and then go back later on and see all this mold over it. So when you're pulling those leaves off the stems, make sure that they're not bendy at all. If there's resistance as you're trying to pull the leaves off, then it's got too much moisture in it. And often they'll sound really like crinkly. It's almost like will sound like a bag of potato chips as you're, crinkling it around and pulling the leaves off. So that's what you want in order to do that. One of the tricks I learned from Jeff and Melanie Carpenter is that sometimes on things that were kind of questionable, like a whole dried hawthorn berry or something like that. And I usually do berries in the dehydrator too, but they would put it in a glass jar or a plastic bag and then put it out in the sun and just a little bit and see if moisture collected on the bag or the jar. And that would tell them like, yeah, no, that batch is not dry enough. We need to keep going. I usually don't have to bother with that, but there's a little video that you can see of me on Facebook garbling herbs if you want to. So storing and drying your herbs, cool, dark, dry is kind of the word here. And you want to make sure you have tightly closed lids. Clear glass jars are totally fine. Most of us in the Northeast like to use mason jars for storing our herbs. And that's great, ensuring that everything's dry before it goes in. And but you just want to store it in a pantry or a cabinet, or not like right above your stove. And not they look so great. You go to the herb shop sometimes and they have them all laid out in the sun and they look so pretty on the wall like that, but they're going to degrade more quickly because they're exposed to so much sunlight. That's one of the things I like about Misty Meadows, is like where they keep their herbs, there's no real strong light coming on them. They're not near a window, and so they do seem to retain their quality a little bit better. And, for things that you might make that are semi shelf stable, then you might throw those in the fridge or the freezer, or at least the back stock. But for most of our shelf stable remedies and dried herbs, cool, dark, dry, tightly sealed, those are the main things that we want to do. And most of our dried herbs will keep for at least 6 months to a year. And really, they usually will keep for longer than that. Most of what you buy in commerce, even from the good places, like even from some place like Mountain Rose, they're one of the better quality companies. But if I get a new batch of something from them and I ask for a certificate of analysis, sometimes it's from a recent harvest, within the last 6 months. Oftentimes it's from, anywhere from 1 to 3 years ago. And then it might sit on my shelf, or you figure, a store gets something from Frontier Co-op and then it sits on their shelf for a while before somebody buys it. And then it sits on their own. So, herbs will keep for longer, but they'll degrade over time. And that's one of the reasons why growing and harvesting your own is so much better, because you're getting a really recent harvest or getting it directly from the farm. The quality is outstanding, especially for some of those herbs that really do degrade pretty quickly over time. I have some information on dosing here and how to make a lot of these recipes on my blog, but let's make some teas. So I am going to, let's see, I will stop sharing for a moment so that so you guys can see me a little bit better. And unfortunately, no matter what I do, I never seem to have a great, okay, good. I am, yeah, definitely still recording. I have to have these panic moments like, am I actually recording? But I am, so we're good. I thought about moving my table around so that I was in a different position, but I think I'm just going to stay like this and hold things up for you. So we have a couple different ways of making tea. The two biggies are infusion and decoction. And I've been kind of surprised even just recently to find that different herbalists define these seemingly very basic terms differently. So I'm going to define it the way that I learned it and the way that I do it. But just know that there are certainly other herbalists who make their teas a little differently. There are many ways to make everything, and that's okay. So let me grab my water. Making tea seems like so basic and obvious that I forget that sometimes people do like to actually see it done and, know how that works. So I'm going to get this warming up for the moment. But first, I'm going to actually make an infusion. So an infusion is just basically steeping the herbs. At least that's how I and how all of my teachers have always defined it, is you just simply steep herbs. So when you make herbs tea from a tea bag, that's an infusion. Although, usually a lot of the tea bag quality is kind of like, and oftentimes they have to add a bunch of flavorings to them to make them, more tasty, considering that the quality of the dried herbs in there is usually not so wonderful. So I have some spoons here, just regular, my teaspoon being my small kitchen spoon and my tablespoon being my slightly larger kitchen spoon. That you don't need to use actual, teaspoons and tablespoons. This is fine. And I have some dried leafy things. So when we do infusions, we're generally going to do that with leafy things, flowers, aromatic things, delicate herbs, things that might lose something if you simmer them. If you cook them a lot, you might cook off all the goodness and get left with something that's not so great. So I have some holy basil from a local farm and some lemon balm from a local farm because I'm already out of my own. So usually I covet my own homegrown for me, but I've been making lots of teas this winter, and so I'm all out. And I was also very busy this past year, so I focused on making tinctures and bought my teas from farms. So if you're going to use to make a cup, now this is actually 2 cups that we have here. And I decided to pull out like local pottery. So this is from Salty Dog Pottery in Barrington from Teresa. Suddenly Teresa Taylor. She makes some great stuff. So you do 1 to 2, and I just do like 1 to 2 heaping teaspoons per cup. Or if you really want it to be stronger, you could do heaping tablespoons instead. There's a lot of flexibility here. And I do use a pretty good amount of plant material. I love using these little, this is from, I'm just telling you these in case you like them and you want to buy them, but there are lots of different ways to make tea. So you don't need to get anything fancy, but these are from For Life. It's the little tea gadgets that they sell. And these particular ones come with a little dish. And so I do this when I'm making tea in the morning for myself, is I just throw this in my mug, and then you put the dried herb inside of the infuser. And so I'm just going to do holy basil, also known as Tulsi. So throw a heaping tablespoon in there. And then I love combining it with lemon balm. I'll throw another heaping tablespoon of lemon balm. And then I could throw other things. A lot of times I like throwing, a sprinkle of flowers or lemongrass or, other flavorful things, but that's a good basic. I like this tea. This will be a nice de-stress tea at the end of the day for me. And we'll talk about these 2 plants in a little bit and how you use them. And then I'm just going to cover it with hot water. Really, really easy. Tea is like one of the least expensive and most therapeutic ways to use herbs. So cover it with some hot water. So, this mug isn't exactly 16 ounces, but it's probably like about 12, maybe 14 ounces. And it's just kind of going to hang out. And I'll give that 5, 10, 15, 20. A lot of times I'll get the tea steeping as the first thing I do in the morning. And then I let it steep until I sit down to have my breakfast. So that could be 5 minutes. It could be 20 minutes. It could be 30 minutes. I'll also kind of prep my tea for the day. So herbs are pretty forgiving. And a lot of the herbs that we're going to talk about today will be decent within 5 minutes is kind of on the light side, but that would be okay. But, 15 to 20 minutes, they'd have a really nice strong tea. But if you let them steep for 3 hours, 4 hours, they get a little stronger, but not by much. It's not like black tea where, the bubbles have to be exactly this size and you're going to you need to hold the kettle this far away and use exactly, 1 teaspoon per cup of water, and don't let it steep for any more than 2.5 minutes or it gets too bitter. It's not about being as specific as true tea as like green and black tea are. Herbs are generally going to be pretty forgiving and they just get a little bit stronger, but they still taste nice. So whether I let this steep for 15 minutes or 6 hours, it's still a decent tea. I've been using my little Yeti thermos, and I was excited to discover, I love when I can put an infuser in a mug, and I'm always trying to find the of course it's hard to open. Whoop. I'm also a weakling. Well, oh, there we go. So I was able to just put loose herb in here, but I was excited by looking at all my various tea to go mugs and all the infusers that came with them, that I was able to find one that fits inside of my Yeti thermos. So I just have loose herbs in here, and that way I can just pour out as I want. So that's been my go-to lately for making tea for the day. It's hard to find good thermoses that have infusers these days. I love little very fine mesh metal infusers are my preferred. I think they work better than most of the other ones, but whatever works for you is fine. So if you can find a teapot with an infuser, they're kind of hard to find too. These are discontinued, but you'll find other brands out there that are kind of similar. But look for one that's very fine mesh metal so that it'll hold back the herbs as best as you can. And ideally one that's pretty deep and big so you can fit all your good herbs in there and they can come in contact with the water as best as possible. You could also just brew them in a jar and then strain them out through a little hand strainer. That works really well too. So, you don't necessarily need fancy equipment. I'm just kind of showing you some of my favorite things. Now, to make a decoction, for that, we're going to simmer it. And that's for our tougher things. So I've got just a pot of water here that's starting to simmer. And we usually do that with the roots and barks and whole spices and mushrooms and things like that really need to be cooked to release their goodness. If you just steep them, you can, but it usually doesn't come out quite as strong. So I've got some dandelion here, dandelion root. So I'm going to throw this is pretty bitter. So I'm just going to do 1 heaping teaspoon. It's good and medicinal. It's not terrible tasting, but I don't feel like drinking super bitter stuff. And to make it taste a little better, I'm going to throw maybe 2 sticks of cinnamon in there. And I'll throw maybe 2 cardamom pods. And then I'll let that simmer. And I find that for most plants that you would be simmering, 20 minutes is usually a really nice amount where it doesn't get obnoxiously strong, but you really do get a lot of the flavor and the medicine out of them. So 20 minutes is my favorite time frame for decocting, but again, it could be shorter or longer. And then once it's done, we'll just strain it out through the strainer. So I'm already coming up. I already have the water preheating, so it's already just about at a simmer. So I'm just going to hope that I don't burn myself in the rest of class, and we'll give it some time to do its steeping and decocting and all that good stuff. And I'll also try to get back to my other tea later and try that out before the end of the class. So you guys are very quiet in the chat box. Do you have any questions so far about harvesting, processing, drying, making tea? I can't see you, so get there we go. So that's a basic infusion or steeping. You can also, these ones are harder to find these days, but I do like them. That was what I was trying to replicate when I was, taking all the various things out of some of the tea equipment I already have and seeing what would fit in my thermos. But a lot of times, I used to be able to get these ones that just have strainers on the top, so you could fill your glass thermos with all sorts of great things and then have the strainer on top that just keeps it out of your face when you're drinking it. But those glass thermoses have a tendency to spontaneously break. They break easily, but also sometimes they just break because you looked at them wrong. So that's part of the reason why they're harder to find these days, but I liked the idea of them. French presses are also excellent. So that's a lot of people love making their teas in a French press. That's also very convenient. And a super infusion, sometimes called a nourishing fusion, is the same idea as a basic infusion, except you're using a lot more plant material and you're letting it steep for a lot longer. So you want to do it with plants that are very safe to consume and are beneficial to consume in really large, really strong quantities. So a lot of our mineral rich herbs are very popular to do that way. But, I can make a pretty good tea with just lemon balm and holy basil this way. But if I wanted it to be more potent, I could make a super infusion with it, or I could maybe mix a little bit of lemon balm and holy basil in with my bland, nutritious herbs and make a super infusion. So you're going to usually weigh your container out and, put your quart container, whether it's a quart French press, that's easier to do, or just a regular quart mason jar, weigh out on the scale 1 ounce of your herb material, which is a pretty good amount. It's often maybe even, anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of the container full of dry plant material, and then cover it with boiling water. Put a lid on it. I don't worry with these whether or not there's a lid on it, but if you're going to let it steep for a long time, it is a little stronger if there's a lid on it. And then let it steep for 4 hours or even overnight. And that gets really strong. So it's the difference of a basic cup of nettle tea maybe has 20, 40 milligrams of calcium. A super infusion might have up to 300 to 500 milligrams of calcium. That's a pretty big difference. And so you do get a lot more medicine, especially for some of those those constituents that are harder to get out. A lot of my gut healing tea herbs I like to do as a overnight super infusion. Marshmallow does really nicely that way too. There are a couple downsides. One, you do run the risk of more bacteria growing in that, lukewarm and even cold environment as it's just kind of hanging around. Usually it's not a problem, but just know that bacteria can really thrive in that environment. So if you're somebody who's immunocompromised, or if you have mast cell activation syndrome or some other histamine issue, super infusions might not be the right recipe for you. You might be better with a quick infusion or doing a decoction instead. And also any technique that really pulls minerals out will also pull any heavy metals out. So you'll want to make sure that the herbs that you're using are coming from non-contaminated soils, because things like nettle and oat straw that bioaccumulate minerals also will bioaccumulate heavy metals from the soil. And then if you do a decoction, which is another good way to get minerals out, or that super infusion method, then you're now not only getting potentially a high calcium, potassium, magnesium tea, but maybe also a high lead and arsenic tea. So we don't want that. So make sure that you're harvesting things from good places if you're doing those kinds of recipes. I also love in the summertime and when we have fresh herbs growing, and also when drinking a hot tea might not be like something that just feels right in that season. It's already hot out. I love to do cold infusions and seltzer infusions. And these come out much less medicinally strong, but it does extract the aromatics and they taste kind of nice and sweet. And they're beautiful, especially if you do them in a container that's clear that you can see. So I collect, sometimes I'll just go to the store looking for a beverage that's in a really cool bottle, drink the drink, clean off the label. And then, I use that for making my infusions and things. And so I'll just put a couple sprigs of fresh aromatic herbs, cover them with cold water or seltzer. You could throw a little bit of flavoring extract like Korean licorice mint. I love to do with vanilla extract. And that tastes kind of like a sort of a posh root beer. It doesn't even need any sweetener at all. And then I just drink that throughout the day. And it's a little bit more refreshing. It's nice and aromatic, and it's like looking at your bouquet as you're sipping your tea. So that's another fun way to do it. And there's a whole blog post with different recipe ideas there, but it's really, really fun and easy to do. We just talked about making a decoction, and here's an example of how you could strain that out later. And when you're blending things, it's always nice with your get to know herbs is to start with singles, get to know the plants individually first, how they taste, how they feel, what they do, research them, try them, just get to know each herb individually first. And that'll make it a lot easier later on to know how to blend it with other things and what it might want. Like you might be like, all right, I like the medicine of dandelion, but kind of like bitter and man tasting. It's okay, but it's not great. And so, maybe I'll throw something more flavorful in there, like cinnamon or cardamom, like we just did, to give it a little bit more of a chai-like flavor and perk it up a little bit. But it helps to know them first as individuals. And also when you're trying new herbs and when you're starting to make new blends, start with small quantities and gradually work your, dose up once you know what you like. And once you know that your blend tastes good, and just play around with it. It's an easy thing to do. Once you've got, your individual herbs figured out, then you can start maybe combining them as like 2s and 3s in recipes, and figuring out like, all right, like what makes it taste better, or what other herb has a similar medicinal action or a complementary medicinal action that might go well, or maybe even a buffering medicinal action. Like I love, holy basil, but it increases digestion and it kind of gets the digestive juices going. I don't always want that if I'm in between a meal. So I might throw a little marshmallow leaf to kind of sweeten it up, but also soothe and coat the stomach at the same time. And I have also, I'm just kind of playing with my temperature here. So it's not, we want it to just be at a gentle simmer over here. So there are a couple examples of really great pairs and trios. So if you have dandelion, it goes nice with ginger and or cinnamon and or cardamom. You can do ginger, cinnamon, and cardamom with dandelion, but every time each herb will do a little something different to that dandelion and how it tastes, and even the actions that you get from that tea. So, doing it bit by bit and getting a feel for everything is really fun. Ginger plus lemon and or thyme and or cinnamon. lemon plus rosemary, fresh lemon wedges plus fresh rosemary is like really nice as a tea or even as a seltzer. Astragalus and reishi are two immune tonics that we might make a broth or a tea with that go nicely together. Echinacea is good for immune health, but combining it with ginger will warm it up and get it to work even better and make it taste better too. Nettle and mint are a classic combo where the mint makes the nettle taste better. It also increases your digestion. So you probably get more nutrition out of the nutritive nettles because you're combining it with the digestion enhancing mint, but it also is a good flavor combo where you've got bland vegetal nettle with this really sharp minty mint, and the nettle kind of mellows out the mint where the mint makes the nettle taste better. Chamomile and mint, another really nice combo, both for flavor and for medicine. Skullcap and passion flower for sleep. They're both calming and sedating. So let's throw them together and make it even more calming and sedating together for a sleep tea blend. Holy basil and which is Tulsi, and lemon balm. I love combining them together because they're both relaxing, kind of uplifting, not too sedating. They boost brain health, but they're kind of more on the calming side overall. And lemon balm's kind of bland tasting, and holy basil is really aromatic. And I just find that combining them, it does a nice job where that lemon balm really grounds that airy, aromatic holy basil, Tulsi, and gives it a little bit more balanced flavor. And then the holy basil gives a nice flavor to the otherwise kind of boring and bland tasting lemon balm. And then rose does a sort of similar thing to the holy basil as well. So play around with that. And there are a bunch of different various things that you can listen to regarding formulation there. And then I have more slides that get a little bit more in depth than we have time for today. But when you're making a blend, I wouldn't really get too focused on like having everything have a specific role, and just play around with it and see what you think might go nicely together and try it out. And if it doesn't taste good, then you can compost it. But, that's how we learn. But if you do want to have an approach to it, you can think of one or more herbs that are your primary, either your primary flavor or the primary medicinal action that you're going for. Then having one or two other herbs that are just going to support it, buffer it, give you some, maybe some stress support or some nutrition or something that's really bland or soothing would make a good supportive herb for a lot of different blends. And then your synergizers are things that kind of move and shake, and spices and things like cinnamon and ginger. And from the garden, we can think of things like fennel or Korean licorice mint or peppermint are movers and shakers that we grow in the garden. And then harmonizers are usually on the sweeter side. So again, like fennel, Korean licorice mint, anise hyssop could go there, but also vanilla, honey, licorice are also classic harmonizers that just kind of hold all the flavors together and make them taste a little better. And then you can also throw a little good vibrations in there. And so those are things that are more for just the other actions beyond the actual medicine or flavor. So the aroma that they impart, or the pretty flowers that you see in your dry tea blend as you're scooping it out that make you smile, or the color of the tea, throwing a little bit of a red hibiscus or blue butterfly, blue pea flowers that turn your tea blue or purple. Just to, make it a little bit more fun and, excite your senses in some other ways. So a little bit more into those individual categories in the extra bonus slides that you can check out when you have the slides. So we've got about an hour left, and I want to talk about I'm playing with my tea here. You can also kind of give it a little jiggle periodically. Some agitation will help make it extract a little bit more quickly. But we're going to talk about some of our favorite tea herbs, my favorite tea herbs that you can easily grow, or a few that you would wildcraft from the wild. And I have a bunch of extra bonus slides too, but we're going to focus in on a handful of them. And I'm curious, in the meantime, if you don't mind, just kind of throwing into the chat box, if you already have some favorites, go ahead and let me know what some of your favorite teas that you grow already, or that you maybe buy that you can grow in the garden. Just put that right in the chat box. Take a little sip of my own tea. This tea has all sorts. This is a tea that I made earlier today, and I've got like holy basil, Korean licorice mint, lemon balm, plantain leaf, marshmallow, maybe something else. Those are the biggies. A little bit of peppermint, technically chocolate mint. And it's soothing. It's nice for my stomach. It's nice for my throat. It's nice for my immune system. We are just in the process of finally getting on the other end of the big sick in our household that my husband brought home from work about a month ago. So I got it a couple of weeks ago. And so little things that help soothe the throat are nice. Also, when I teach, I like things that soothe my throat. So stinging nettle, this is not something you probably want to cultivate in your garden. Only crazy herbalists actually plant stinging nettle in their yards because it is a weed and it does sting, as somebody was talking about earlier, that she didn't realize what it was and went to grab it out of the pasture and was like, whoa, I'm sure that woke you up a little bit. Stinging nettle does literally sting. It stings like a fire ant bite. It contains these little like hairs that you see in this picture here. These are like little syringes. They're called trichomes. Trichomes are also what's like on cannabis that has all the things that everybody gets, all the cannabinoids that people get excited about. Nettle does not have cannabinoids, but it has trichomes, the same kind of idea. And they're like little syringes that are filled with various compounds, including histamine and formic acid, which is what's in your fire ant bite. And it also contains various neurotransmitters like serotonin and acetylcholine. So it is a little bit like a wake-up call when you get stung by it, and it will cause some hives. The medicinal name, or the Latin name in medicine for hives, is urticaria, and the Latin name for nettle is urtica. So they both come from the same origin. I am not quite sure which got the name first, and then the other one was named after it. But basically, this is the plant that gives you hives. And then the Latin name dioica refers to the fact that this particular species is dioecious, as it's like where its reproductive parts are on the plants. And so that's what urtica dioica means, is the dioecious plant that gives you hives. And once it's cooked or dried or previously frozen, it generally doesn't sting anymore. But if you do process it yourself, when you're garbling it, there still will be like a little bit of sting in it. And so you may want to wear gloves, or you may want to not. I mean, you could choose to get stung if you want to, because there are therapeutic benefits to being stung. You get the hives, but then your body sends out anti-inflammatory compounds to combat that inflammation. And oftentimes people will find that after, a little bit after that subsides, that if they have arthritic joints, they're not so arthritic anymore, and they might get a couple hours relief, a couple days relief, or even sometimes a couple months relief. So I've heard of folks who have like really bad rheumatoid arthritis that will intentionally go out and harvest their nettles throughout the whole season without any gloves or anything and just get stung all over. And that has ended up being really beneficial in reducing their overall body inflammation throughout the whole year. I personally have like slightly iffy joints, and I haven't noticed it makes a difference for mine. Occasionally I'll whack myself with some nettles, and it doesn't seem to really make a difference for me, but you can play around with it. Sometimes people also will notice that their allergies reduce, but you could also just make a tincture of the plant, and that does not sting, and take that. And that's another way to use nettle, especially for allergies, because the fresh is a little bit better for allergy support. But once you dry it and make a tea with it, or if you buy it dry, it doesn't sting when you buy it usually. Then it's just really mainly a great source of nutrition. It's really high in calcium and magnesium. It like knocks the socks off of almost any other plant that you could have around. That said, holy basil is pretty high in nutrition, but you might get really low blood sugar if you tried to use the large quantities to get much from it. And dandelion leaf is also really, really high in minerals, but it is a little bit on the bitter side. So that can sometimes be off-putting. Nettle's just kind of bland and vegetal. Some people love it. Some people hate it. It's pretty easy to blend with more flavorful herbs and not really notice once it's combined with those other more flavorful herbs in tea. Very high in calcium. So you could get about 300 to 500 milligrams of calcium per cup of a super infused tea. Or if you do a similar percent of herb to water and you decoct it, that'll get even more minerals out of it than a super infusion would, because minerals, like the more you do to your plants, the more you get the minerals out. It's also pretty high in magnesium, potassium, and a pretty good source of vitamin K. So when we look at all those things together, we can assume that this plant is pretty good for bone strength. And there isn't a lot of research, but there is a little bit of animal research that does suggest that to be the case. But anecdotally, herbalists often will use this in large quantities in people's protocols. And you can also cook with it and eat it in various ways. I cook it down to a puree, or I cook it down and then puree it in a blender and then freeze it in ice cube trays. And then I can just pop it into a smoothie or throw it into my soup broth. You may want to, if it's even at this level here, this is a really perfect, beautiful harvest right here in like probably like late May here. The stems are starting to get a little bit fibrous. So you probably will want to remove the leaves off the stems before you cook it or puree it or make a recipe with it fresh. But if you're drying it, you'll dry it on the stems and then remove it off the stems later on. But the stems can get a little stringy. So if it's really young, like right out of the ground, and it's really the stems are still tender, you don't necessarily need to remove them from the stems. It is diuretic. So it will make you pee more, especially when you first start drinking it. So that's something to be aware of. It is a nice kidney urinary tonic. It does seem to help cleanse uric acids, which is going to help potentially reduce the incidence or frequency of gout. And let's see, it does have some antihistamine properties, more when it's fresh for allergies, but you might get a little benefit from drinking the dry tea on a regular basis, but it's not as strong that way. What else do I want to say? It is just because it's so mineral rich. Some people will just use it as a general overall tonic, thyroid support, energy support. It's not like a strong, it's not strong in these actions, but it just because it's providing the body with this deep nutrition over time, the body just becomes more vital and everything about the body can become more vital. It is a little bit of a blood sugar lowering herb. So that's something to keep in mind. If you were going to have it on an empty stomach, unsweetened, that may not agree with somebody who tends towards hypoglycemia. But if you were having it daily, with your meal or at the end of a meal, you might get some benefit from keep blood sugar a little bit more stable. The roots do have medicine as well. You could make a tea. Most people tincture it, which is an alcohol extract, but the roots have a little bit more affinity for toning the bladder and the prostate and the pelvis. So folks who have incontinence or just poor pelvic tone or benign prostatic hyperplasia will sometimes use nettle root as part of their protocol. And there are other herbs that are supportive for that too. It does look a lot like some of the various mint family plants. We don't have that much stinging nettle in New Hampshire that's growing wild because our soil generally stinks, and nettle likes it to be kind of rich and moist, but like really rich soil is what nettle loves. And New Hampshire does not inherently have a lot of rich soil, but you guys have farms and you probably also have really nice compost piles. And in those environments, you might find that nettle just sort of spontaneously arrives in those areas. But we in New Hampshire have a lot more of mint family, quote unquote, nettles that look a lot like nettles before they bloom. But when they bloom, they have your cute little mint family kind of flowers. Whereas nettles, this is their flower here. They have boy and girl flowers. I think these are the girl flowers, if I remember correctly. They're so tiny, it's hard to tell. But they both look kind of sort of like this. So these are the flowers, which are kind of distinctive, and they sting. They do look kind of like something in the mint family because they have opposite leaves. The stems are kind of square-ish. Jim McDonald likens it to having like those little cocktail straws that have the two ribs. Like if you put two of them together and you get that little like four-ribbed or a little clover leaf, that's kind of what the stem is like. But it could look a little bit like a mint family plant. And some of those mint family plants look a lot like nettles. And often they have nettle in their name, like hedge nettle, hemp nettle, dead nettle. And if you mix it up, they're not toxic, but they don't have the same medicinal properties of the stinging nettle. And I do have some info on these slides. I got my chat box over it, so I can't really see very well, but I've got some basic growing information and harvesting, and then just some of the like energetic and key medicinal flavor kinds of things about the plants on the slides for you. So there's lots of info on each of these slides. And I see you have answered my questions. So let me take a look and see. So I love raspberry tea, but I'm buying it. I'm assuming that's raspberry leaf. So yeah, I mean, we have so much wild raspberry around. So in the spring and early summer, you can go out and harvest your own. Just I might want to wear gloves. And I do have a bonus slide on raspberry leaf in here, but you might find that the homegrown stuff is like way more, even more yummy than the stuff that you buy. I love chamomile and lavender at night. That's a nice relaxing blend. I make chai tea in the morning. Lovely. And if you like buy lavender and chamomile, good quality, they're pretty expensive. But if you harvest them, you find out why, because it does take a lot more effort to harvest flowers than it does to harvest leafy things. But they are so delightful. And then I have made chamomile and peppermint, but I haven't grown it in New Hampshire. So those are very easy to grow in New Hampshire, so you can play around with it. So holy basil. I'm going to take another sip of my tea here. And if you have questions, plug them in the chat box. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask if you prefer to speak that way. So, oh, and you know what? Before I get into that, I think I think it's been about 20 minutes or so. I didn't put on a timer or anything, but we can take our 2 teas and see how they came out. So I have my decoction. I'm just going to try to not make a big mess. It's the downside of teaching in a classroom and making remedies there versus in your kitchen. So I'm just going to kind of hold it over the strainer. Unplug this because my hot plate sometimes likes to turn itself on even when it's off. So I got my tea. It's probably too hot to really drink yet. That's actually pretty nice. It gets a nice little sweet hit from the cinnamon, and which complements the bitterness nicely. And then you've got that spicy chai-like flavor of the cardamom. And then we've got my holy basil lemon balm. And if I wanted to be really, I'm just going to pull my little thing out here. And if I wanted to get even more out, I can just use a spoon to sort of squeeze as much out as possible. Usually I don't bother, but it does get more out of it. And then I've got my tea. Oh, and they come with a little dish to put it on, but I didn't do that. And I'm so excited that I can taste it because I didn't lose my sense of taste, but I did lose my sense of smell. And so for a little while, all my aromatic herbs smelled and tasted like nothing. So I'm gradually getting that back, which is great. So holy basil. Love, 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 love this plant. So, there's a category of herbs called adaptogens, and adaptogens are herbs that help your body adapt to stress. It's kind of a trendy term these days. And sometimes you hear it put out as like an herb that helps your body be healthier. That's really more vague. Adaptogens are very specific in what they're doing. They're usually helping to modulate your stress hormones, working through modulating how the stress hormones communicate between your brain glands and your adrenal glands. And they often also support mitochondrial health. They may support oxygen utilization, and they are generally very non-toxic and modulating. So they usually help your body find a balance of homeostasis versus putting things in one specific direction as far as those stress hormones go. And they have a lot, each adaptogen usually has a lot of different things and body systems that it supports, but it varies from plant to plant. And the exact vibe of each adaptogen is a little different. And most of our adaptogens are kind of hard to grow, and they're roots that, take many years and grow in really harsh climates. So like ginseng and rhodiola and ashwagandha, not so hard to grow. I do have a bonus slide in here for it, but Cotinopsis, Eleuthero, these are things that, you're not going to be able to just grow in a season, and you might have a hard time growing them at all. But holy basil is an adaptogen that's really easy to grow, grows very abundantly, and you get lots of plant medicine. And in this case, we're using the aerial or above ground parts of the plant rather than the root. So this allows you to get lots of harvests, pretty much right away. As soon as you plant your seedlings in the ground, you grow this much like you would grow a whole regular culinary basils. It likes it hot. It likes rich but well-drained soil with moderate moisture. And when it's like 90 to 100 degrees out and everything else in the garden is like falling over, holy basil is with your other culinary basil's going like, yeah, bring it. Like, we love this, you know? So holy basil comes from India. It also comes from Africa. So it really likes those hot climates and will be very happy here. Now, in earlier in summer, if you plant it and it's still kind of cold at night, they'll sit there and look at you and go, this is not India or Africa. Like, what are we doing here? And as soon as the frost comes, they'll start to die off as well. But loves it when it's hot out. You can start them from seed and plant them outside. And the variety that I particularly like to grow is the one that if you're buying it from a seed house in the United States and they don't specify, it's probably this one. But if you do have a seed house or a seedling place that tells you the varieties, it's the Kapoor or the temperate Tulsi. Tulsi and holy basil mean the same thing. Sacred basil, same thing. But there are a lot of different varieties and even a few different species that are used somewhat interchangeably. And this particular one that's shown in my garden in that picture there is the one that grows the most abundantly and easily in our ecosystem. So you'll get a lot more medicine from that. And holy basil in commerce, the quality is often not that great. Like, it's often very bland tasting. But if you get fresh, beautiful, or freshly dried holy basil from your farm or from a garden or from a local farm, the quality of the flavor is just so much better than what you would get from the big companies. So it's relaxing. It's an adaptogen, so it does help with stress hormones, and particularly, most of our adaptogens are a little bit energizing, and holy basil is gently energizing, so it's a great one for that, but it's not overly stimulating. It's another thing that's kind of handy because not everybody needs to be revved up. They just want kind of calm energy. Holy basil is good for that. It's also a nervine, and nervine, we have a couple other nervines that we're going to talk about today. And nervines are herbs that nourish and support the nervous system, especially if it's a modulating or tonic nervine. It's just it's not going much on the energizing side, but it's just kind of maybe uplifting a little, maybe calming a little, usually not too sedating. The term nervine can be defined by different ways by different herbalists, but most of us will use it as something that just sort of nourishes and supports the nervous system and is usually gently calming and uplifting. And holy basil is that in addition to being an adaptogen. It's also a nootropic, and a nootropic is an herb that helps support brain function and cognition. And holy basil, and really actually all your basils are good at that. It's a little bit hypoglycemic, so it does lower blood sugar a little bit. And it's particularly good when stress is one of the main triggers of blood sugar being off, and also sugar, cravings for junk food that are related to stress and blood sugar wobbles going together. Because when you're under stress and you produce a lot of the stress hormone cortisol, one of the other things that cortisol does is it pulls sugar from storage and puts it into the bloodstream because it thinks you're fleeing from the saber-toothed tiger or you're fighting the saber-toothed tiger. You need sugar to fuel your cells. And so even if you're not eating sugar, if you're stressed all the time, your blood sugar is going to ratchet up a little bit. And so holy basil does a nice job helping with the stress hormones as well as helping with blood sugar. And so if you have it with a meal, oftentimes you'll find that you feel a little bit calmer throughout the day, but also more satisfied, and that it becomes easier to make healthy choices throughout the day because you're not on this blood sugar stress roller coaster going, give me cheese and toast or give me a donut. You can be like, maybe I should have a salad with some salmon instead. And it's easier to make those decisions when your stress and your blood sugar is more stable. That said, if you are prone to hypoglycemia and you have it unsweetened on an empty stomach, it could make you lower blood sugar. I know I'm personally very sensitive to that. So I usually will focus on having it with a meal, or I might throw a little bit of honey into it or something like that. And then if I'm having it without food, and that will just be enough to help make it so that it's not lowering my blood sugar. You can make all sorts of recipes, pretty much anything you want to make as an herbal remedy, you can make with holy basil. It makes an excellent infused cold water or seltzer. It blends with so many other aromatic and bland herbs. It's very aromatic and clovey and minty kind of tasting, its own animal of flavor. And most people really like it. Some people don't. Some people find that it makes them feel a little spacey. Some people think it makes them feel even a little bit on the high side. It's rare, but some people think it makes or find that it makes them feel a little bit anxious. That's not typical. Usually holy basil is helpful for calming anxiety and grief and trauma and all that stuff. But there are some people who have a paradoxical response. Maybe it's from blood sugar going too low, or maybe it's something else entirely. It's hard to say. There have been some animal studies suggesting that it might do some wonky things with the thyroid, but those were all animal studies. I haven't seen any human studies, and it was all very high doses. And I do use this quite a bit in clients who have thyroid stuff and have yet to see any problems at all. And usually it seems to be helpful because no matter whether your thyroid is high or low, usually we got stress and inflammation and other things going on, and holy basil tends to be helpful. So I don't think it would be a problem, but just, have that on your radar. It may have some anti-fertility effects. It's usually not recommended in pregnancy. I don't know about nursing, but it's not really probably going to make it so that later on in life you can't have kids. But if you're trying to get pregnant, I might lay off the holy basil just to be on the safe side. So any questions about holy basil? I'm gonna have another sip of my, which tea was this? Yeah, holy basil, I think. Oh yeah, definitely. It would taste like more if I had a fully functioning nose right now. So lemon balm's another one of my absolute favorites. It's definitely probably it is the first herb that I ever really got to know as a plant in the garden. I have a cousin named Melissa, and she was living at my parents' house at the time that I was first kind of getting interested in herbal medicine. And my mom and I share our passions. And so she's a nurse, and she was at a garden center, was like, oh, cool. Like, this herb is named Melissa. I'm going to bring it home and show Melissa. And so that was one of the first herbs that I played around with as a plant. And it's named Melissa after honeybees. And it's an herb that oftentimes beekeepers would use to rub on the hives, to relax the bees, and to also attract the bees to an area because it's very calming. So Melissa has a relationship with honey and honeybees. And then officinalis is in the Latin name, means that this is the official species of lemon balm that was used as medicine. So it has a long history in pharmacy as a medicinal herb. It comes from particularly like the Mediterranean and also the Middle East. That whole Fertile Crescent area has if you look back into the oldest herbals of those areas, you'll find lemon balm mentioned in all of them because it was a very revered medicinal herb, and it's super duper easy to grow. It can get a little bit, I don't know if invasive is quite the right word, but it's definitely pretty robust in the garden when it's happy. It, like the holy basil, likes it to be kind of rich soil with a little bit of moisture, like a veggie garden bed would be its dream place. And it even likes it a little bit like slightly shaded. It does fine in full sun, but if it gets like dappled sun or there's a fence that kind of blocks it from the harshest sun of the day, it's pretty happy with that. It'll grow even happier because it doesn't like to get too dried out, and it doesn't like when soil gets really dry and sort of anemic and malnourished. But it's a pretty hardy plant, so it will still grow in almost any situation, but it will be happiest and it will start to spread in its happiest places. So, but there's so many great things you can do with lemon balm. It's all good. So it makes a great tincture, alcohol extract. In fact, what you make at home with the fresh plant through the techniques that I have in the blog post links and some, I think maybe I have a slide or maybe not, but there are definitely some links to blog posts and how to make tinctures. Way stronger than anything you can buy, and better for things like digestion and sleep and nervous system support and herpes and cold sores. And like, it just does so many great things, kind of like holy basil. It's one of those sort of all those in a bag of chips kinds of plants, but it's most well known as being a relaxing nervine that's not overly sedating and is a little bit uplifting. And there's quite a bit of research on its nootropic or brain boosting benefits. And that's that word, if you are wondering, like, what's this word she's saying? Nootropic, nootropic. That's the word here. And that's like the smart drug, or basically. And there are quite a few studies on both the aromatics of inhaling or having it applied and also ingesting it, showing that lemon balm can help kids who have attention and impulsivity issues, to kids and folks in college, and helping with them with stress and also their cognition, to regular, healthy adults. Within just 1 hour of taking it, they had less anxiety and better cognition on tests, to elders with Alzheimer's and dementia. Certainly not a cure for those things, but that they were a little bit more calm, that they were less socially withdrawn, that they were in a better place when they were having lemon balm. In that case, they were rubbing lotion with lemon balm in it versus just getting a massage with lotion without lemon balm in it. So lots of, small studies, but really neat studies with great uses and a super long history of use for lemon balm. It is also kind of like lemon balm and nettle, sorry, like holy basil and nettle. It's a very mild hypoglycemic. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're having it as a tea. It's usually good, but if you were having it on an empty stomach, you would want to put a little sweetener in it, a little honey. Tastes quite nice with a little bit of honey too. And it's very mild tasting as a dried herb, and the quality of in the mass market, kind of like with the holy basil, buying it from a big bulk distributor, the quality is just nowhere near as good as if you grow and dry it yourself or you buy it from a local farm. It's really just so much better that way. It will lose its lemony flavor pretty quickly, but it's still nice in tea blends, and it's especially good to combine with other herbs in the teas because on its own, it's not that exciting tasting, but it makes such a great complement to so many other herbs to support mood, cognition. It does have some antiviral effects for herpes, especially the tincture is pretty good, but it's not a bad thing to consider for tea. There's an herbalist, Andrew Bentley, who has been working with lots of folks with COVID, and he found that not like it wasn't curing anything, but he found that after folks would have some tea with lemon balm and some tinctures with lemon balm, that their symptoms would just be a little milder and that they would feel a little better. Plus, it is a great herb for stress because it's calming and uplifting. And when you're dealing with unpleasant viral infections or just living in a pandemic time, having a little bit of stress support is not a bad thing. It's a little bit of a mild digestive bitter. So some people do find that it helps with certain types of reflux, digestion, also sleep without being too crazy. It's very kid friendly, and you can blend it with other things that are a little bit more flavorful, like a wedge of lemon and some honey, or some lemongrass and some honey, and make a really nice tea from that. So definitely a worthy one to grow if you don't already. And I think that's just a comment, but I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, great. I'm glad to know that you are finding class interesting, even if you don't have any questions. So dandelion is a good base. We're kind of talking about tonic things that are tonics tonic is a very vague term that just kind of means like it's good for you. You can have it on a daily basis or very regularly, and it just supports your body in some kind of way. So it could be a nutritious tonic, it could be a nervine tonic, it could be an adaptogen tonic. It just means that it's pretty safe and it's got some really nice benefits. And the more often you have it, generally, the better it is. So these are the categories that we're sort of covering first. And so dandelion root, especially, you can use the leaf as well, it's nutritious, but it's also more bitter. It's gentle bitter. It's not too crazy bitter. So you can still make a decent cup of tea. And bitter herbs help with our digestion. They turn on all the aspects of digestion. So things move through the digestive system better, that your stomach acid and your enzymes and all that are better produced. There is some inulin that's in the roots as well that feeds your beneficial bacteria. Some people get a little gas and bloating from inulin, although, most of that gets strained out in a tea. So usually not an issue in tea. But if you're somebody that gets super gassy from bread and beans and apples and cauliflower and chickpeas, and then you drink dandelion or burdock tea and you get gassy, then maybe your digestive system needs some work first before you can do dandelion. But most people do pretty well with it. And bitter flavors also stimulate bile production so that we detoxify a little bit more efficiently through our liver pathways. It's a little bit diuretic, so it also helps us detoxify through our kidneys, and it makes us pee a little bit more, but the roots are not as diuretic as the leaves. The leaves have a French name that translates to pee the bed or piss the bed. And so, the leaves are pretty strong volume diuretic, but the roots are more gentle. And so, liver detoxification, if we have healthy optimal detoxification, then usually our skin is going to be better. Our allergies might be a little bit better. And then because of those bitter aspects, our digestion might be a little bit better. We often feel a little bit more vital. So this is an herb you can incorporate on a regular basis for all of those things. Let's see anything. Oh, the leaves make a really great pesto. I definitely recommend that. You can Google it. I have recipes on my blog, but you can just Google dandelion leaf pumpkin seed pesto, and you'll probably find either mine or one of the ones that I based my recipe off of. And it does taste a little bit coffee or chocolate-like, especially if you dry roast the roots. So once the roots are chopped up and dry, usually we dry roots in the dehydrator to make sure they're thoroughly dry. You can then take those dried chunked up roots and toast them in a pan in the oven or on the skillet, just dry, no oil or anything. And they'll get a little bit roasted and kind of like you're roasting coffee. And then you can make tea with that, and that will give an even stronger, bitter coffee roasted flavor. So some people use dandelion and some of its relatives as a coffee substitute. And it tastes decent. It doesn't have caffeine in it. So it's not, that could be a good thing. And that maybe you're trying to avoid caffeine. It could be a bad thing. And that you want your coffee substitute to energize you. And dandelion doesn't energize you, but it is a good herb for lots of things. And it's one that we would typically be wild crafting because we don't usually need to plant dandelion. We can just go out and find it, but make sure to get it from clean soil, because like any of the plants that are good at accumulating minerals, they will also bioaccumulate heavy metals. So make sure that you're getting it from good places. I have in the past, when I didn't have property of my own, and also my soil outside of my garden spaces is not that great. I'm in a pine forest, so really sandy soil, and so my dandelions are really sad looking for the most part. I started to get some really great ones growing in the walkways lately, so I purposefully would use those to throw into my eggs in the morning and dig up the roots periodically. But in the past, I would go to like my organic farm CSA and be like, so can I go around the edges of your property and harvest your weeds? And at the time I belonged to a CSA that had been a farm for like hundreds of years. And so they're like, yeah, please do. And so that was a great way for me to go and wildcraft clean herbs from organic farm soils. Probably wasn't always an organic farm, but hopefully it was. So marshmallows, another pretty bland herb, but an absolute favorite of mine. It might take a few years for this herb to really like take off. Although if you have good soil, which if you have a farm, you probably do, it can grow pretty well just within one season, but it's a perennial. And we do use the roots as medicine. They're very slimy when they get in contact with water, which soothes and coats the stomach and is great for irritated digestive systems and healing the gut and all sorts of other good stuff there, acid reflux and that kind of thing. And it's a little sweet too. So they make a great addition, like those supportive herbs in a tea blend. I could have thrown it in with our root blend here and it would have just softened and sweetened the flavor just a little bit. And also given it a little bit of a velvety texture from that slime, mucilaginous slime. If you have the powder, it gets like snot-like consistency. But if you're just doing cut and sifted roots or the leaves, it's just this nice velvety texture for the tea that's very soothing, nice for the throat, nice for any mucous membrane or the skin. Really anywhere throughout the body that it comes in contact. Also kind of soothing for the lungs as well. And it's pleasant tasting. I also use the leaves a lot. So in my garden, sometimes I harvest the root. More often I'm lazy and I just buy the root from commerce, but I love harvesting my own leaves and you can get lots of leaf harvest. It's like a fun plant because you can go and pet it in the garden. It's very soft and fuzzy. And the tea as a leaf tea blends really well with stuff. So it would have been a great addition to this lemon balm and holy basil tea. And it would have just rounded out the flavors in a really nice way. It doesn't add a whole lot of flavor on its own, but it just harmonizes and softens the blends. And you can use other Malva species pretty similarly. So, and this is an Althea, not a Malva, but they're very closely related. And so you can use the other Malva leaves and flowers and add them to your infused waters. You can make your teas with them. And some are weeds, some are ornamentals. Hollyhocks I hear can be used similarly, although I don't grow hollyhocks, so I haven't done it. And the flowers, you can dry them and throw them into your tea blends. So really nice to play with. And one of my favorites really as a tea, especially if you're somebody who tends to be really dry. Sometimes nettle can be a little too drying for folks, but adding things like marshmallow leaves and violet leaves that are a little bit mucilaginous and moistening can be really nice. And I tend to get dry throats really easily, so that helps. And unfortunately, that just went down the wrong pipe, but hopefully I won't cough too much. I'm really bad at swallowing tea. So red clover, I don't talk about this one as much, but I think I must have said to Christine that I would talk about like hormone supportive herbs. And maybe she had mentioned that folks were dealing with menopause or something like that, which I can totally relate to because I am in menopause too right now, and it really stinks.
I sure did. Sorry.
And a lot of the herbs that are my go-tos for that are not like my favorite tea herbs. So things like hops and black cohosh, which I do grow and is a good one to grow because it's not one that you would want to be wild crafting, and it's often adulterated in the wild, and vitex, but like none of those were really good tea herbs. So I thought I'd include red clover because this is something that's very easy to grow, easy to wild craft, and it does make a really nice tea. And it is a potentially supportive herb for that time of life and many other times of life too. So it's a gentle plant estrogen. So it will just go in and give a little bit of an estrogen. I mean, it's like less than 1% of the estrogenic activity of your natural estrogen, but it just can give a little buffer if there's not a lot of estrogen happening later in the menopause process. But if people are having issues with excessive amounts of estrogen or estrogen that's not being opposed nicely with progesterone, red clover is nice too because it will bump out some of the stronger, less pleasant estrogens from the body and create a little less havoc from that. And also xenoestrogens. So if you have plant or estrogens that are coming from chemicals and things in the environment, hopefully you'll just try to avoid those. But red clover may also help kind of bump those out so that they don't have as much of an opportunity to wreak their havoc on the body. So it's helpful as a plant estrogen. And then as a plant estrogen, sometimes it can help with hot flashes and just general menopausal, perimenopausal symptoms, bone strength. And it also is a nutritive. So it does have some nice minerals in it as well, which is going to additionally support the bones. It's pretty, it's a pretty herb to throw in the tea. And I mentioned before, I often like to throw flowers into things just to make the tea blend look prettier. And red clover will definitely do that. So it's a popular one to throw into women's tea blends or just, it might not identify as a woman, but you've got ovaries or you used to have ovaries. So you might want to throw some red clover in there too. And men can also, men and folks with testes can also drink red clover. It's not harmful for them, but that's all there. But then you can also enjoy it for bone strength teas and just general, like, I want to make a nice garden cup of tea. And the flavor is mild. It's a little bit sweet and hay-like and very pleasant. So it's a nice thing to throw in the blend. It's also a little bit lymphatic. So that's one of our other sides of the detoxification systems that's going to go in and clean the interstitial fluid that is around, like outside of the cells and outside of the organs. We have this fluid that's in our body, and the lymphatic system is what deals with cleaning that out and like going through and, from both an immune perspective and also from a detoxification perspective, cleaning that fluid and making sure that the body is healthy and humming. And red clover seems to help move things through the lymphatic system more efficiently. Let's see, what else do I want to say about it? Oh, interestingly, plant estrogens, many of them are in the legume family, like red clover, soy. I prefer clover and beans and flax as plant estrogens over soy personally, but there's a lot more research on soy just because soy has a much bigger marketing department than everybody else does. And so they fund lots of studies. Red clover is a lot more mild than soy, but for the bones, it doesn't seem to help build bones, but it does seem to help prevent bones from breaking down as quickly post-menopause. And with these legumes, having beneficial bacteria in your gut seem to help your body activate the more active form of the plant estrogens in it. And so having one of the studies combined probiotics with red clover and found that it was nicely effective for hot flashes and supporting some of the perimenopausal symptoms when they combined the beneficial bacteria. So maybe, I'm just theorizing here, you could be eating some fermented veggies at the same time that you're also, in the same day that you're also drinking your red clover tea. And if you're doing that regularly, you might get even a little bit more hormonal balancing support from your red clover by supporting your gut health. The downside is it's really not clear. There is a history of use around helping to reduce cancers. It's not anti-cancer, like it's probably not going to get rid of cancer all on its own, but it does seem to have some supportive effects for certain types of cancers. But the evidence for estrogen dependent cancers is really unclear. There are some like really preliminary lab studies that suggested that it might actually activate those estrogen dependent cancers like breast cancer and ovarian cancer and endometrial cancer. But they also were not really reliable kinds of studies to let us know for sure what really happens in the human body. But it does give us a little bit of reason for pause or caution around that. So just be aware that if you do have a history of estrogen dependent cancer risk, that red clover may be helpful or it may be harmful. And we just really don't know yet at this time, and be aware of that. So also red clover can grow fungus pretty easily. And if you feed things to livestock, you might already be aware to look for, weird icky stuff that's growing on your clover and not feed it, because the fungal things can be toxic. So make sure that, with all your plants, that things look happy. And if you Google images, you'll find it, and it doesn't look nice. So it doesn't look pretty and happy and vibrant. Also, when you're drying it, this is one that I make sure to do in the dehydrator, because if it's allowed to wilt versus just dry really quickly, it can form coumarins, and coumarins lend a sweet flavor, but they also can be a little bit toxic to the liver, and also can be a little bit blood thinning and may interact with some medications as well. Probably in the amounts that we as human beings and tea have, it's probably not enough to make a big difference as long as it's totally dry at the end. But it is a concern when you're feeding it to livestock. And so you have to be really careful about the drying process. And so I would just dry it in the dehydrator to be sure. And they'll retain their colors really nicely and really beautifully. And once you've dried it nicely, you'll still have gorgeous red clover. I just leave the flowers whole in my jar, and they'll still look great like 5 years later if you still have it kicking around. But what you buy in commerce is like brown dust. So this is another plant that's better to grow your own or get it from a farm. And it's a cover crop. So if you don't already have it growing, you can just buy the cover crop seeds and plant it. And just usually with herbs, we're looking for like the basic, wild, plain, nothing really fancy, no fancy varieties or cultivars or anything like that. Just like plain Jane, red clover. That's what we're looking for. So we got 10 minutes left, but I think we've got plenty of time to cover a few more herbs. And again, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. But we've got lots of really great flavorful herbs that we can grow in the garden. Lemon, a lot of the herbs that we just covered, they don't taste bad, but they're not really that exciting tasting, except for holy basil. Holy basil is very flavorful, and a flavor that most people enjoy, and a flavor that blends well with a lot of our other leafy and flowery herbs from the garden in tea blends. So of course there's mint and peppermint and all the other mints, and that's a great mover and shaker. It's got so many different medicinal activities. It stimulates digestion. Sometimes it can bother acid reflux because it stimulates digestion and relaxes muscles, which is good for like gas and pain and bloating, but might not be good for the sphincter above the stomach in reflux. So a lot of people with reflux find that peppermint's too strong for that, but maybe other mints might still be okay. And I personally really like spearmint and apple mint. And mints in general can be pretty ill-behaved in the garden, and peppermint's kind of not too bad, I find, but it still will spread. Spearmint, especially certain types, can be, I'm really regretting thinking, oh, I don't mind if I get more spearmint because I love spearmint. Well, I'm not happy with the spearmint because no matter what we do, it's just like taking over a whole section of garden, and we've covered it with cardboard and we rip it out every year of different, I just want it to be a small patch, but it wants to be everywhere. So, be aware of where you plant it. Apple mint's another one that I love. It's really great as tea. It makes awesome seltzer. It's great in recipes. And so I love using that one. And that's like the fuzzies. It's apple mint is the one that people go, oh, I have this mint from my yard. I don't know what kind it is, but it's yummy and it grows really well. Here, have some. It's like the friendship bread of the mint family. And it's like soft and slightly gray looking. And that's really ill-behaved because it just kind of like, I don't want to be here. I want to be over here and over here and over there. And it just keeps going. So planting it in a large pot that you sort of sink into the ground can sometimes rein it in a little bit. Also, you can just plant it in a place that you can sort of mow it in. So where my apple mint is, it's sort of taken over that area, but there's not really any other gardens around it. It's just lawn and pathways and things. So we just kind of keep mowing it down, and we like it. So we let it stay. It's great for making cocktails and things too. Peppermint is the most medicinal, and chocolate mint is a variety of peppermint. Peppermint itself is actually a hybrid of your spearmint and water mint, but then chocolate mint is a variety of the hybrid of peppermint. So it won't grow true to seed, but it's, as you probably know, mints are very easy to divide or take cuttings or layer or anything like that to propagate it. And so peppermint and chocolate mint, pretty similar. Also, wild mint is pretty similar as well, being very high in menthol, which is very perky, uplifting, good for clearing the sinuses, great for making like little eye pillows, delicious in teas. I'm a peppermint person, but other people might be more spearmint people or apple mint. And then there are so many other kinds of mint out there. Banana mint is one that my mother really likes. It's not my personal favorite. It does have like a weird tropical banana, like fake candy kind of flavor to it. And it is coming back every year in her garden. Pineapple mint is a pretty yummy one that may or may not come back in the garden. It's kind of got a mild, soft, but nice mint flavor. So you can really enjoy your mints, but plant them in different parts, because if they breed and seed, you get these kind of like nondescript mints that are usually less yummy. If the plant itself is just continually growing from its own rootstock, it should maintain its own genetics. But it's if it has a chance to interbreed and seed, you might find that you have some mint that's less exciting. You don't want to use large amounts in pregnancy, and although the essential oils have a lot of great uses, it is very caustic, so I'd be careful with that. And I do have a whole blog post on essential oil tips and myths and benefits and facts and all that good stuff that you can check out if you want to. Now, Korean licorice mint, you guys are farmers. Please grow this. I will set you up with seeds. Contact me whenever. I have seed packets that I'm happy to send out to people because I want more people growing it, and I made from my own plants. And then in the springtime and especially later in summer, it self seeds pretty rampantly, and I love sharing the seedlings because it's beautiful, it's delicious, and it is almost non-existent in commerce. And there seems to be a lot of variability for these Agastache species. So Agastache rugosa is the Korean licorice mint that I love. And then there's anise hyssop that's a little bit more common in some gardens. That's Agastache funiculum. But the one that I have is the one that really tastes the best. And where the seeds came from, they no longer sell the seeds. So I'm hoping that somebody will commercially grow this so then I can send people to it. So I'm happy to set you up. Give me a shout in the growing season, or if you want me to mail you a packet of seeds, just let me know. And it's got this lovely, soft fennel honey like flavor. It's very delicious. I actually have it in my thermos. I've been drinking it a lot throughout this sickness that has been going through the house because it tastes good. It's soothing for sore throats. It does have a history of use for colds and also stomach issues in Korean traditional medicine. And it's just delicious. It makes excellent seltzer and cold water infusion, especially if you add a little bit of vanilla to it. As I mentioned before, it kind of has a root beer flavor. It's very sweet. You can use the dried leaves in your kitchen, just like you would use fennel seeds, and add it to salads, or the fresh leaves to salads. You can put it in wraps, like if you're making your Asian style wraps, it's delicious in that. So really beautiful. It's a short-lived perennial. So usually after like the second or third year, it'll die, but it also sets out a bunch of seeds. So it's a rampant self-seeder, but very easy to remove. It doesn't grow by underground root runners like some of the other mint family plants do. And you can also do very similar things with anise hyssop, but I find that anise hyssop has a little bit of a sharper minty flavor that I just don't personally like as much. But that one's a little bit more available in the garden world. Like neither of these are very common in commerce, but I don't know anybody who is really selling licorice mint, Korean licorice mint commercially. And if you do, let me know and I will send people your way. Fennel is another great herb for flavor, and I mostly use the fronds. So I love growing bronze fennel, and that has a little bit of a purplish hue. So if you make it into a vinegar, it'll turn the vinegar like this pretty magenta-y color. If you put it in a glycerin extract, it turns more like a violet purple color. If you make seltzer with it, it's initially clear, but if you let the seltzer sit for several hours, you'll get this like very faint, like purple hue to your seltzer, and it's delicious. citizen seltzer. If you like if you're a Sambuca lover, then you would probably like the fennel in there. And you can cook with it and you can add to recipes. And then you can grow seeds. Last year, I don't normally bother with seeds because it just seems tedious to me. But last year I had so much fennel going to seed, and it just was doing really, really well that I did manage to get like a whole jar's worth of dried fennel seeds from my plants, which was exciting. I just kind of air dried it most of the way and then crisped it up so it was totally dry, and then kind of rubbed it around a bit to get the seeds off. And so that's what we've been using in our kitchen. But it's great as tea. The fennel seeds especially are great as tea, and the fennel fronds I love to use in like various liquid extracts. Lemongrass, and I might end on this one, but lemongrass and lemon verbena are two tender perennial tropical plants, and they are much yummier than lemon balm when it comes to lemony flavor. But and they're different. Lemongrass has the best strong flavor of lemoniness, and it's sort of similar to like what a lemon Fruit Loop kind of flavor would be. Or if you like Thai cuisine, they use a lot of lemongrass in the curries and the soups and things, like the tom yum soups, and some of the Thai curry pastes feature lemongrass pretty prominently. And so that kind of a flavor profile, and it's delicious as tea. And even though the lemongrass holds it better, it still will lose its lemoniness pretty quickly. But if you take the top parts that are more grassy and flat and trim them off of the bases, you use the tightly woven bases, use that for making soups and stocks and your curry paste and that kind of thing. But then you can dry the tops and use those for tea. And sometimes I'll just put them in a little braid, like when I was growing up and we would go to like Palm Sunday and then we braid them into little braids. So you do that and then let it dry, and then you can just snip little bits of it into your tea, and it's like almost oily. It's so rich in essential oils and really yummy, and goes really nicely with a lot of these leafy aromatic herbs and these bland herbs that we're talking about. Lemon verbena is got more of like a lemon cake. It's a delightful aroma, but there is a little bit of a green, slightly bitter edge underneath, and lemon verbena will taste better if you use not quite totally boiling hot water, or if you're blending it with other, more milder flavors like marshmallow or oat straw or something like that. And I often will throw lemon verbena fresh or freshly dried in my green tea or black tea in the morning to make it taste nice. You can do all sorts of other fun things with it too, but combining it with vanilla will give it even more of that vanilla cake-like flavor. But they are tender perennial, so they don't survive the winter unless you bring them indoors. I usually don't bother. I just plant new seedlings each year, but I do bring other things like my rosemary and my gotu-kola and my bacopa and stuff. Those do come indoors. I do not baby my plants, and I don't have a lot of time. So anything that requires a lot of attention like that, and I do use these little bottle waterers to extend my neglect a little bit further. I've got some slides in here on spices and my favorite chai-based recipe that you can check out, and then just a bunch of extra stuff. So I'll just kind of scroll through so you see we've got information on roses, calendula, lavender, chamomile, and more just things I happen to have slides of. So I thought, we'll leave them in there. You guys can have access to it. So oat straw and oat seed, great cover crop and great medicinal. Great tea, violet leaves. So all these things make nice teas. Violet, I love to work with, especially coming up soon. It'll be in season. Red raspberry leaf, horsetail, and there are all sorts of links of things you can check out on the bottom. Chicory, burdock, black and blue elderberries, bee balm, love bee balm, makes great tea, drinking a lot of that this past month too. Rosemary, so many great medicinal properties to rosemary. Gotu-kola, great Indian plant and adaptogen and tonic. Skullcap, great nervine. Passion flower, that one's a little harder to grow because it's more of a tropical plant, but I have mine in a pot. It's more just for like experiencing it because it doesn't grow a whole lot, but you can, it needs to come in the winter unless you're in a really warm spot. Wood betony is beautiful and medicinal. Ashwagandha is another Indian adaptogen that, and also comes from Africa too. That is a really great one to grow. That's a little bit more energizing, but calming too. That's thyroid booster as well, and pretty easy to grow. It grows like tomatoes. It's in the nightshade family. So if you know how to grow tomatoes really nicely, you can probably grow ashwagandha too. And yeah, that's it. So Does anybody have any questions? You've been super quiet throughout this whole thing. So this is your last chance to ask me questions before we close down for the night. Anybody? Well, I'm going to stop recording and I'm just going to open up my screen.